We're back. We've got another one of our New Zealand friends is going to be joining us in a moment when they pop up on the screen. We've got Wagner is joining us from New Zealand again, and he is going to be talking to us about Logic Apps, which I think is a massively underrated technology. So I'm really looking forward to getting some new ideas of what we can do with Logic Apps. Wagner, over to you.
Thanks, Aaron. So let me set everything here and ready to go. Welcome, everyone. My name is Wagner Silveira. I'm a digital integration practice lead at TITA and Microsoft Azure MVP. And what I'm going to try to show here in the next 25 minutes or so is some new scenarios with Logic Apps. So let's go through the agenda and see what I'm going to try to discuss. So the first thing is I'm going to be talking a little bit about identity-based authentication. There is a couple of things that came up with in the last year or so that not everyone is taking in consideration. We're going to be talking about state versus speed, like when to use some of the new features that came with Logic Apps standard. We're going to talk about the concept of Logic Apps anywhere. And then finally, something that is was a big problem with Logic Apps before, that is private network integration. At the end of that, then I'm going to try to give you some takeaways for you to think about when you finish the presentation. And in some of those, I'm going to have a demo, so started helping me to pray to the demo gods. So let's start with the identity-based authentication. So on that, what is the story so far? Basically, if you're thinking about inbound, when you're trying to get into Logic Apps, there was only one way for you to authenticate, and was sharing keys. So you have like that big or massive URL to access your Logic Apps, and a part of that would give you some share keys, right? If you're thinking about going out of Logic Apps into all of the things that Will and Anna talk about, the ability to have a lot of connectors, and that's actually one of the great value propositions for Logic Apps. But there is two things that was usually a problem here. One is the identity was always associated to the connector itself, and as a connection, right? And there is a named account or connection string. So there is no way to identify the Logic Apps as a user. Instead of that, you have to put like a service account or your own account to make sure that worked. So what is new on that? There is two things that is really, really interesting. When you're thinking about inbound authentication, we have the ability now to do OAuth-based authentication with the Logic Apps when you're trying to do a request to that Logic App. And when you're thinking about outbound authentications, now you have the ability to create a managed identity for Logic Apps and use that to authenticate against some of the connectors, right? So how that happens? The first thing that we can do is there is new authentications options on the consumption, on the Logic Apps consumption that are going to be showing. And also there is new managed identity options in some of the connectors for both consumptions and standard. So that is like a lot of things that we didn't thought much about before, but we didn't have a way to use before, and now is available on Logic Apps. Let's take a quick look on that first one, the Logic Apps inbound authentication using OAuth. So I'm going to change it back to my Azure here, right? And what I'm going to show you is, first, let's take a look at Logic Apps. And inside that Logic Apps, we have now this option called authorization that was not here before, right? So when you look at that, now you have the ability to create one or more policies for the Logic Apps to say to receive an JWT token and evaluate the JWT token and say, if you receive the informations with those claims, you can get inside. Otherwise, you're not able to. The demo that I have for you is this. I'm going to show you inside API management. We have an API called Azure Serverless Conference with a single method, right? But on this method, what we're going to be doing is, as I go into the Logic Apps, I actually setting I'm in the right one, yes. So I pass in a record with my MSI access token, right? I'm actually creating my authentication, the managed identity, calling a specific Logic App application, enterprise application, putting that information on that MSI access token if it's valid, and then I pass in that as a bearer token authorization into the Logic Apps. So let's see if that actually works. If I go to Postman, I have here first the call to that endpoint, right? And you're going to see that the headers that I'm passing to that endpoint, I only call passing the OCPA ping subscription key. That is the share key that you needed to authenticate against API management, not against anything else, right? So if I go and call that, and the demo gods are with me, I'm going to receive a very complex response. Let's see what's happened. There we go. I receive a very complex response called hello world. That means that the Logic Apps is actually being called, and you can say that happening. We have a call at 5:09 p.m. New Zealand time, right? And that basically execute my hello world. But if I try to call that same Logic App now directly, even with a valid, what seems like to be a valid token, let's see what happens. First, I have a security token expired, right? So one, it identified that I'm trying to pass a token that is not valid. Just make sure that you guys can see that. Okay, but that's fine. That can be fixed. Let's try to get a new access token. There we go, we have a new access token, and I'm going to be using that one, and I'm going to be sending that. On that token, because it didn't come from the API management, that was the only item that I'm allowing to go through, it received an error. And you can see that prod 01 Logic Apps 2F28, just to prove there is nothing on my sleeve. And if I go to my trigger, it didn't even execute it here because it didn't access. Right, I just wanted to find my trigger definition here. Let's forget about it because I don't want it to spend time. I just wanted to prove that that Logic App is the Logic App that is being called. But just to recap on this, right? Authorization is something that you now is able to implement using and take advantage of JWT token instead of taking advantage of just the shared connections, right? Let's go back to our presentation. Let's talk a little bit about the gotchas on that, because you always have some kind of gotchas, right? So the first one is inbound authentication is not available on Logic Apps standard yet, right? So you needed to take that in consideration. You can disable shared access keys, even though you're using the authentication, the OAuth authentication method, if you get hold of the share keys, you still should be able to call that logic app. And if you pass a logic app without the share keys and the authorization, it is going to complain about you don't have some share keys, right? So there is no operator on policies. You see that I only had like this equals that, right? There is no option to say if that claim contains something. And just to complete, although we didn't look at a managed identity because we're not going to have time to go through everything, managed identity is only going to be enabled for selected connectors, right? So when you're looking into the connectors, try to take a look if managed identity is available, and if it's available, try take advantage of that. It's going to make your system much easier to manage because it's going to be passwordless and more secure. All right, so let's go to the next scenario. Let's talk about state versus speed. So what is the story so far? The first thing is there was only a single model for logic apps. When you're looking at logic apps consumption, for example, there is only one model, and the model is state is king, right? You always have a state on each one of the connections. What that means, everything that is like a before and after an action on logic apps, that state is kept. And that is really good from one side because allow you to connect to knows exactly what's happening inside logic apps, something that we sell as one of the big advantage of logic apps. But on the other side, all of that auditing take a toll in terms of performance. And there is only so much optimization that you can do, right? So you can combine actions, you can try to make things more condensed to avoid to put like that much pre and post authentication, but you can only do that so far. So what is new on that? Well, the first one is you can choose a model now that is closer to your requirements, right? There is two models available on logic apps compared to just the stateful model that we had before. And the first one is the stateful workflow. And on the stateful workflow, what you have is the ability to have full auditing to everything that happens on your logic app. You have like for the trigger, what happens, what initiated the trigger, what is the result of that? For each one of the actions, what was the inputs for that action, what is the outputs for that action, right? That makes your troubleshooting incredibly simple because you know exactly where it fails and you know the data that makes it fail. It also gives you a lot of support on your resubmission. Since you have the inputs that trigger your logic app, that means now that you can resubmit your logic app from the portal or from the engine itself instead of having to receive a request again to initiate that. Then you have the stateless logic apps, right? What is the advantage of that stateless logic apps in this case? One is a lot more throughput, right? Because since you don't have that the burden to have to audit everything, you're going to be able to run those things faster. You also have an advantage here from a cost point of view. With Logic Apps Standard, now you're paying for both the engine running inside an environment that just like Azure Functions, but also you're paying for the storage to store all your metadata or auditing, right? You're paying for the in this case for your storage account. So if you're using stateless logic apps, you have less things written on that storage account, so you're paying less. right? And also have ability to privacy. One of the things that was really that people really complain about logic apps is, especially when you're talking about private data, was you have to go to every single action inside the logic app and select which action that action has secure inputs and outputs, right? So you needed to remember everywhere the data that was supposed to be private and shouldn't be seen even by the people that is managing and supporting the logic app. You needed to enable that the input and secure output for it to be obfuscated or to be encrypted. So the people that is supporting wouldn't have access to that. With the stateless logic apps, because that is not being implemented by default, it is not being audited by default, that information is not there, and you needed to force to actually enable that for debugging. So how is that working, right? What does that creates that magic? The first thing is what it's doing now is the new models on Logic Apps standard. If you needed to use stateless Logic Apps, you needed to implement that on the new Logic Apps deployment model that is the Logic Apps standard. The Logic Apps consumption doesn't have that option for you. So stateless Logic Apps is going to give you high throughput. You just needed to remember that. And stateful Logic Apps is going to give you high resilience, so auditability is going to allow you to actually, resilience in this case, the ability of submitting messages without the requirement of your, your source having to send the trigger again, and auditability from the point of view that you know exactly what's happening on each one of the actions. But as everything, there is some gotchas on that, right? So the first thing is stateful or stateless needs to be a design decision. And the reason for that is because each Logic Apps only have a single state. And although in theory you should be able to change that states, not everything that is available in stateful is available in stateless, right? So for example, you have managed connections with triggers from managed connections. You don't have all of them. You only have the HTTP requests and the timers. And variables, those are the two things that I notice are not available in Logic Apps stateless, right? You can always use the compose action to manage variables. That's what we used to do before, right? But you're not able to use variables itself. So this is the second state, right? Let's take a look at next the second scenario. Let's take a look at the third scenario. That is Logic Apps anywhere. So what is the story so far? The first one is the only place we could deploy Logic Apps was on Azure, right? And you were bound to a resource group. So you have a Logic Apps bound to a resource group and existed by itself. It didn't. It was not something that you could combine together and deploy as one package for something. Your boundaries or your package was a resource group. And how it's done today? What is different today? So first, you have now a choice of deployment. You can deploy the Logic Apps by itself, or can deploy the Logic Apps as a group of workflows if using Logic Apps standard. That means that now you have the choice of the packaging, right? You can deploy as a set of ARM templates, or you can deploy as a package based on web apps format or function format using the Logic Apps standard. And also you have the choice of compute. You can deploy on Azure using the consumption engine. You can deploy on Azure using the serverless or the PaaS component based on Logic Apps standard, and you can deploy on any other cloud or on premises. How is that happening? With the introduction of Logic Apps standard, now you have the ability to deploy either using the PaaS or using the containers, right? So if you wanted to use the Logic Apps by itself, you can do that using Logic Apps consumption. If you wanted to use Logic Apps as a group of workflows that represents an application, you can do that using Logic Apps standard. And if you wanted to deploy outside Azure, you can use Logic Apps standard package as a container. If you're running that on premises, you can use run either inside your Docker server, or you can run that using a Kubernetes server. And if you wanted to run on any other cloud that's not Azure, or even inside Azure, you can use Kubernetes. So what are some of the gotchas of that? First, you needed to choose your storage, right? And depending on where you put in that information, you might have like differences on how that's going to work. Right now, for your Logic Apps standard, you only have the ability to deploy that on the Azure storage, but the SQL Server as a storage is starting to become available, and there is a preview for that. Second thing that you needed to think about is your management plane, right? So if you're running that on Logic Apps, that is on Logic Apps standard, and you deploy in Kubernetes, you needed to find a way to integrate to see the management plane. And the way that that's working today is by using Azure Arc. So you should be able to see your Logic Apps like it was running on Azure, and because of that, you would be able to see and manage your Logic Apps. And you needed to take a consideration built-in versus managed connectors. Managed connectors is still going to require Logic Apps, a resource group for that to be deployed. And when you're talking about managed connectors, are the connectors associated to Azure. So finally, let's talk about private networks. So one of the problems that we have with Logic Apps before is you only have outbound integration, right, for private networks. And that was based on-premises data gateway. So you would only be able to actually connect to either a private network or on-premises using on-premises data gateway. And then was kind of on-premise data gateway is very broad brush, right? It needs to you open a pipe into that network, but you don't have much control. So what is new? Outbound and inbound integration is available now, right? You'll be able to define if you wanted to have integration from your Logic App, from your private network into the Logic App, and Logic App into the network. It's much more focused because now you're able to actually define exactly what is going to be integrated. And how is that working? Again, using the Logic App standard, because Logic App standard is based on the functions engine that that is based on the web app framework or the web app engine, you're able to leverage from outbound options like VNet integration and hybrid connections. So you also have the ability to have inbound options with the private endpoints, right? But let's actually take a look at that instead of just talking about through a little demo. So just going to jump here quickly because I can see that we're getting really close to that. What I'm going to show you on this one is on Logic Apps standard, although that is a logic app, right, with its own workflows, for a couple of workflows, right, I have now the networking ability. And on network, I have the ability to do inbound traffic by access restriction, by app assign address, or by private endpoints. And for outbound traffic, I have the ability to do VNet integration and hybrid connections. Okay? So I run a really quick item here. I'm going to show you that this is actually going to the Logic Apps standard, and just going to insert this item here. The demo is working. Here is the proof, right? You can see that this is actually running on my laptop, and I have those 3 entries. Now I'm going to execute the same thing from going to the Logic Apps standard that is going to connect to the hybrid connection and call my SQL Server. So let's see if it works. So first comment, this is a demo for Azure Serverless Conference. Anonymous is saying Wagner is cheating. Sorry, I'm not. And then me saying, no, the demo is working. Here is the proof. All of that, although looks like a really simple demo, went up to the Logic Apps via hybrid connection, call the SQL Server inside my Logic Apps and come back, and using hybrid connection. That means that I'm not able to open everything, just that particular IP and port. Let's go back to this session. What are the gotchas on that? The first is you needed to understand that that's going to be only for selected connectors, right? There is some built-in connectors that are able to use the VNet integration. Those built-in connections are grow on time, but just take that in consideration when you're thinking about how to use the Logic Apps virtual network features on standard. Then finally, let's go to the takeaways. So the first one is obvious. Now with Logic Apps open a lot of new scenarios, right? And now with Logic Apps standard, you're able to create workflows, but bring it really close to app development. Before it was, is this thing on the portal that you have to develop, and then later on has a lot of ways, a lot of work to actually deploy. Now is something that is together with your development environment of choice, the package just like an Azure function, deploy just like an Azure function. But just remember that there's still a new technology, right? So there are some gaps that might affect your design. So make sure that you understand what are your choices and to see how it's going to work properly, but also don't discard consumption, right? Just because Logic Apps standard is there, that means that the consumption is not part of the puzzle. It is still something that is quite useful. And that is me. Right, if you wanted to connect with me, you can go to the connected through my Twitter, or send me a message on my personal email, or connected to my blog post.
Thanks, Wayne. That was really great. I'm someone that thinks that Logic Apps is a technology I need to learn more about and never invest the time. So I love seeing demos like this and just how easy it is to use as a stack or as a tool in our toolbox. And that hybrid connection stuff that you showed at the end, super powerful because it just makes it so much easier if you're doing hybrid application design where maybe you're not ready to put everything in the cloud, but you can still use the power of the cloud there.
Cool.
But
yeah, it was like it's something that is really interesting in with the Logic Apps standard now is growing a lot and is going to get much closer to developers. So we should be hearing a lot more about Logic Apps, even more than what we saw before.